All right, so hopefully you can see the slide deck with the initial slide starting shortly. Okay, all right, then let's kick it off. All right, so welcome to this SAIMA session, which is the 19th session of SAIMA. It's hard to believe we have had 19 sessions spread across multiple years. SAIMA stands for Salesforce Architects in the Making. It's a very informal group which was started long back by Johan Furman. And today we'll talk about a very important aspect of Salesforce architecture and also of the CTA journey, which is called governance is key. Getting a little bit of an echo, so I'll just check who's not on mute and then I'll mute them. Okay, I think we are good. Yeah, so briefly introducing the SAIMA leadership team. And before I actually ask them to introduce themselves, a little bit of history. So SAIMA, as I said, was started by Johan Furman. You might know him as the admin who became a CTA and who's done some astonishing things in the ecosystem. So I still remember the first session I attended of from SAIMA. Johan was actually solo, and then he got some support from a few others. And then I told him I want to join in. So from the second session onwards, I and Johan, we worked as a tag team. And then I think at some point of time, we realized that we need to hand over the baton to people who can do it better than us. And then we have the very capable team of Neha, Meera, and Lilith doing it. Lilith, if you could quickly introduce, I know everybody knows you, but if you could quickly introduce yourself to the group.
Yes, sure, no problem. Hi, everyone. I'm Lilith van Biese. I'm in Belgium. I'm a CTA, and I'm a principal architect at Salesforce. And yeah, very happy to be part of the SAIMA group leadership and work with amazing people like Gora. So yeah, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Lilith. Meera, are you on as well?
Yes, Gaurav. Yeah, hello, everyone. Myself, Meera. I am from India. And I'm in the Salesforce ecosystem for the past 16 years, and I'm also leading Trivandrum Architect Community Group, and also I'm Salesforce MVP, and looking forward to an amazing session today. Thank you all.
Do we have Neha as well?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good evening. This is Neha. I'm based out of Dubai and working as a Salesforce technical architect at Vegan IBM company. I have around 9 years of experience in this ecosystem, and wow, it's our 19th session already. Gaurav, I reciprocate your emotions at this. And I'm looking forward to this very amazing session because I'm going to soon attend my board, and it's definitely going to help me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we will move on. So today we have an absolute rock star panel, and I'm really excited to be hosting all of you. And I see Ian with his signature guitar in the background, so that's a good sign. So we'll start off with some introductions. Ian, since you joined the latest and last in, first out, so we'll go with you. If you can quickly introduce yourself in a minute or so for the audience.
Yeah, obviously founder of Elements.cloud. Been around the Salesforce ecosystem 21 years, so that means I'm allowed to drink, and heavily involved in helping people understand their org, build better implementations. So we're all about making sure you build the right things. So it's all about upfront analysis, upfront architecture, and therefore good governance. Once you've done that, I think then you can build the right things. But it's all about making sure upfront you understand what you're meant to be building, and I think governance is critical to that. And I think we'll see some common themes coming through the conversation today.
21 years is a long time. I've been in the ecosystem for 15, and I thought it was a lot, but 21, I think you beat everyone hands on. Ines, we'll go to you next.
Sure, with pleasure. Well, I'm Ines Garcia, and as it says over there, I do tend to say that I'm an inventor, because I invent things for a living. I think we all do, and we shouldn't forget the creative part of the work that we do. Being in the ecosystem since 2013, I have 17 certifications, Salesforce MVP, published a couple books. I can stay still, as you can probably tell.
Yeah, thanks, Ines. Jitendra?
Hey everyone, good morning, good evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Jitendra. I am a Salesforce MVP, CTA. I have been on ecosystem from the last 14 years now. I am working in IBM as a technical architect leader. And this is one of my favorite topics because I am mostly governance basically. So I'm mostly working on the transformational enterprise projects. Spanning the team like from 60 to 120. And what I have seen in my career, right? Technology is really not the cause of the problem.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was on mute for a long time.
No, we were able to hear you, but there was some background noise, but I've muted those people, so you can go ahead now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Where did you all miss me?
No, we caught all of it, most of it, yeah.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Okay, and then Mark, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey everybody, my name is Mark Braga. I am Senior Director in Architect Relations at Salesforce. I've been with Salesforce about 6.5 years. A good portion of that I was in our professional services, so I spent a lot of time with our big customers, dedicated to one customer at least for a year, helping them with best practices in architecture and governance, which is one of my favorite topics as well. And now I'm in the Architect Relations team, so everything that you see in the Salesforce Architect brand, architect.salesforce.com, the Salesforce Architect blog, that's all our team. And I'm a CTA, coach, judge, and been prior to Salesforce, I was a customer since going back to about 2008. So been around a while, not as long as Ian, but a while. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And I think everybody here would agree that I think the architect.salesforce.com site I think it's grown by leaps and bounds in the last couple of years, or ever since it launched. And I think a lot of credit goes to you, Zane, and the whole team. So thank you for that.
Oh yeah, thank you. Feedback welcome too. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Matthias, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you. So I'm Matthias Franken, working at Capgemini as a delivery lead for the Salesforce projects. I think compared to my fellow panelists, I'm fairly new into the ecosystem. Will be around, I think, 4 or 5 years. Before that, I did a lot of different jobs, which I think gave me a very holistic view on the ecosystem, but just in delivery and things like governance in general. I also worked very closely, for instance, with the salespeople at Capgemini. So also from a user perspective, of a good view on Salesforce and so on. So I think I can still add quite some value here in this call.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. So the way we'll run it, I'll talk about that, but the overall vision, and I think this tech has not changed since the first session that we had for SAIMA several years back, is we want to support each other as technical architects. This is not an official Salesforce architect group, but again, the idea is that like-minded people come together and we help each other in our journey. And that is how we've been running it. Good reminder to mute yourself. We have had a few people cause some background noise. Any questions, all questions are welcome. Ask them on chat and we will take them towards the end. So the way we'll run it is, like, I did get a number of questions from the audience. We posted it. We posted a Google form. I have a few questions, and then I collated some of those questions. And obviously, we are not perfect, as you can see. We have technology challenges as well. And lastly, as I said, this is a very open group. We have had so many different presenters and so many different hosts. Like, I'm coming back to my presentation duties after a long time because we had a lot of people from the community who wanted to get associated as hosts. And then this is a fairly open group. If you want to present or if you want to host, reach out to any of the SAIMA organizers and we'll be happy to accommodate you. So today's topic is governance is key. And I'm sure, like, I think we've all had some really good memories and some horror stories in projects when it comes to governance. And today we'll talk about both aspects of governance. So I put together some slides. I realized that in the audience, we may have a few people who do not know much about governance. So I think just a very high level overview, and then we'll dive into what governance is. So broadly speaking, you could classify in multiple buckets, and there is a really good Trailhead module on it as well, which talks about some of the key areas of governance. So it's all about like the broader vision and the overall strategy which you have, which includes your org strategy as well. Talks about your business backlog, how you factor that into projects and overall the overall implementation. Then the classical software development life cycle, Agile, Scrum, or whatever methodology you would be using. Data strategy, architecture, and management, which again is a key aspect as well. And then communication strategy, which, like at least in my experience, is often undermined, and this is often where things also go wrong. Some examples, like this is a governance model example where we have obviously different roles, and this is again a part of the overall governance strategy. You have the end user stakeholders, you have external resources, you typically establish center of excellence. And then again, I'll not read through the slides, but as I said, we do have experts in the panel, and I'll be asking a few questions so that we can pick their brains on what a good governance model is. This was actually a fascinating image, which I actually read in a blog, which was from 10K, which is a Salesforce partner as well, which talked about, and I'll actually post the link for that particular blog post. It actually summarized the overall idea of governance in different buckets, which is organizational capabilities, COEs, design authorities, operating models, architecture types and org strategies, implementation access, and the mission scope and organization. And as I said, like I've read this post about 2-3 times. I really liked it, like a bird's eye view, as well as very, very detailed in each of the sections as well. I'll post that link. Another thing which is really good, which has happened is, I don't know how many of us here have heard about the SOGAF model, which is in a way derived from certain other frameworks which were open source for architecture. Again, there is a lot of detail on this available. If you're curious, then just search for SOGAF Salesforce, and then you'll find some very detailed posts. And I'm not really sure if Mark has written a few, but we would love during the course of this session if we can share some insights on things like SOGAF, well-architected framework, especially when it comes around governance. Obviously, governance also deals with data protection regulations and data residency requirements. And again, I think we have all been through these challenges in projects. There are solutions like Hyperforce, and there are ISV solutions like Own Backup, App Exchange, and then there are solutions again like Elements Cloud and others which try and solve these challenges in different manners, and we'll talk about those in the panel as well. So I'm just trying to give you a very high level overview of what we'll talk about. So this, I think I took it from the CTA notes, a very simplistic diagram in terms of how you could derive your strategies in terms of the org strategy, whether it's diversification, replication, unification, or coordination. Again, the idea is not to spend too much time on it, but to kind of, I'll actually skip these slides because these might be covered in a different session. So now we'll come to the business end of this presentation, and we'll start the panel discussion. So I think the first question I have is, just a second, let me make sure I have the right list because a few questions came in.
Hey, Gaurav, since you were talking about the SOGAF stuff on the website, that I shared the link to the blog that we had on the Architect blog, that you'll notice the SOGAF content is actually removed from the website now as we try to reposition it in the context of well architected. And so that'll be coming shortly. But for everybody that is tuning into Dreamforce or attending, Martin does have a whole session on SOGAF at Dreamforce this year. So
excellent. Thank you for sharing, Mark. Okay, so the first question I'll ask, and I'll actually ask it to my good friend Jitendra, because I think I've seen him as a champion of good governance in Salesforce projects. So Jitendra, according to you, what are some of the key metrics from a governance perspective when it comes to large and complex Salesforce implementations?
Okay, you all can hear me clearly now this time, right? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So, thanks, Gaurav, that you mentioned, right? Understanding the governance, right? It's not just the technical DevOps here we are talking about, right? It's not just a sandbox strategy, moving the code, but really it's like about the people in your organization, right? The process that you're using and overall what the tool you're using, right? So I will not go in much detail, but what comes in my mind, high level KPIs when you talk about the DevOps is really, for example, if you're going with agile methodology, mostly I think most of the companies are going because that's how the Salesforce's rapid application development platform. I see, okay, what are the total, so how many features we have? So if I go by PI planning, right? So how many features, how many user stories you have? What is the trend going on? So these are few of the KPIs that, okay, in each PI, let's say you had, just an example, you had to deliver 100 you had committed for the 100 user stories, right? Out of the 100 user stories, how many you are finishing up? And if you are not finishing up, right, as a part of the DevOps, right, as a part of the governance and all the meetings that we are having, right, normally, so going back and learning, okay, what is the problem, right? So those KPIs would help you. For example, what is the velocity trend of the team? So you have a team comprised of like architects, you have developers, right? How much your team is delivering and what is the trend of that team, right? How much you are missing up, right? And what is the trend of the defects, right? How many defects or how many bugs, right? Are they growing up, they are going down, right? How many issues are being reopened, right? So those are few of the KPIs, I will say, that every team should have. Either you're using the ALM tool like Azure, you're using like Jira, right? I think all those tools does provide the dashboards and the KPIs, capabilities, right? And again, not to miss, one of the important KPI that also we should set up is the code quality itself, right? Either you're using SonarQube or PMD, right? Or the tool from the AutoRabbit, right? How your code quality is going up, right? Initially, when you started the project, right? Okay, you had so many addresses, right? Because the team is new, process is new. Is that trend of the PMD analysis going down or going up, right? Why the team is not keeping up? So really, it's like high level window to the overall team members and what exactly they are doing. So I will say these are some of the high level KPI that we should think upfront in the DevOps, right? Because if you cannot measure something, right, you cannot say it's a success or failure, right? Everything must be measurable in the whole governance cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Ian, I'll come to you next, and probably you crunch some of these metrics for breakfast because you're on the other side, and I think you've built a solution which is all around these metrics. So what are your thoughts on some of the key metrics?
I think when you think about governance, you're looking at the overall, like from everything from idea through to implementation. So the key metrics are about actually user adoption. It doesn't matter how much technology we build if we're not finding that the users are adopting it. And the metrics, if we start with those metrics, which is have we designed the right thing, and then have we gone and built the right thing? And Jitendra came out with some really great metrics about, are we building it well? But when we think about the overall picture, which is, are the number of end users who have access to Salesforce, are they logging in using the features as we expect? So things like Salesforce event logs. So you may or may not have got that switched on, but the ability to understand the patterns that users are going into applications. So that gives us a couple of angles. One is, if they're not using it, why not? Is it because we built the wrong thing? Is it because it's too difficult to use? Or is it because actually we don't have the right user patterns there? So that can then drive feedback into, again, what should we be changing? How should we be changing the training content to make sure we increase that adoption? So I always like to think from the very end, which is, have we delivered what was expected? If we haven't, then we're not maximizing or exploiting Salesforce as we should do. One example, we had a user event at a Tesla dealership, and the Tesla manager said, if it's not in Salesforce, it doesn't exist. And I think that's a great mantra, which is if we think about that from an end user perspective and from a product owner perspective, you're writing a check for Salesforce, you need to exploit those licenses and exploit the power of Salesforce. To do that, we need to make sure it's being used. So I think if we come up from those metrics, then everything else flows back from that, which is, are we capturing the right requirements? Are we writing the right user stories? Are we then delivering those effectively and reducing rework? All those other metrics flow from the back of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit on a key metric. I think it's all about adoption at the end of the day. If it's not adopted, then it's probably not worth the pain. So Ines, I'll come to you next. And I think like I've known you as a project governance champion for a very long time. So any key metrics that you look at from a governance perspective, it could be project management or otherwise.
Sure, thanks. So things that comes to mind so far from some of the content that we had is that for me is about the faster route that brings most value. So the aim here is to have a governance that's going to help us to reduce noise, reduce waste, and that's waste of time, of effort, of energy, of materials, right? Energy, we consume a huge amount of energy in the work that we do. So focus into what matters, the faster route or the sooner path to return. And so we think today how there are two competitive advantages for any company. One would be about the ability to go fast to market. And the second one is once you go to market fast for the things, those bets, those little things you put out there, the ones that work, how can you persevere? How can you move those ideas into fully fledged products? Now, the four things that I tend to influence for any team to start tracking, one is about lead time, right? From that inception of an idea into actually getting it out of the market. And so you find out that lead time is composed, yes, about cycle time from starting the work to finishing the work, but there is more to the story than just cycle time. Another one is about deployment frequency. How often do we put things out there? Right? Measure it. This is something that you can do. Right? You don't need a magic tool that's going to come and save you. There are ways that you can tangibly measure that today. Now you know how often you put things out there. Measure your change fail. Right? Look at it as a percentage out of all the things that you put out there. How many it's not surfacing in the way that everybody hoped for, right? It's either pass or fails. This is Boolean, true or false. There is no in between. So work with the teams, spot the reasons, what can be done, how can you ease the pain? It's a constant pursuit of perfection rather than a destination because things are on flux all the time. So, whilst you're continuing delivering that value, it can only gonna get better. If we get stale, we're going backwards. And so the fourth thing that you wanna measure is the mean to restore, right? Because we live in complex systems. We are complex systems as a human itself. We won't be able to foresee absolutely everything and things are in flux. So because of this, right, it will always be something that doesn't go to perfection. So how quick can you recover? And measure it in minutes, right? So out of all these different things, how long did it take to get up and running? Create a dashboard. There are many things that you can do. Make it visual, make it obvious, make it an information radiator. I think for me, these four things can make a heap of a difference for a team. So if you're becoming better at what you do.
Yeah, I think the fourth one is also very important, as you rightly said, business continuity, like how quickly can you get up and recover? And do you cover these in your book as well by any chance?
I get some flavors of it, not specifically about this four, but yeah, some of the things and some of the stories of teams that I work with, right? Some of the stories are good stories, some of the stories are other not so good stories, but all of those are reality, and that's what we all live every day.
Yeah, so for those in the audience who do not know, like Ines is a published author, and I think it's a fantastic book. Like I've not finished it, but like I'm almost halfway through. So Ines, if you could drop in the link to the book in the chat whenever you have a moment, and if any extra discounts you can offer for our group members, that will also be helpful. So Mark, I'll come to you next. Like any inside secrets that you can share, like in terms of good governance or when it comes to the Salesforce implementation life cycle that Salesforce internally follows, which might benefit the group?
Yeah, so I was taking notes while all the other panelists were speaking in this. I'm going to pick up on a few things, because one that always comes up, you know, not so much in CTA, but like when we're talking with architects at our customers, or when I was, you know, in that role of professional services, is this concept of, you know, we've talked about how the types of metrics we want to capture. They need to be measurable. They need to be certain units of measure, that sort of thing. But it's often overlooked that you need to baseline them at the beginning. If you're going to communicate the value of what you're implementing at some other point in time, identifying that it's measurable, and then identifying how you're going to be able to baseline that, and then doing that early up front so you can track it and then communicate from there on. That's super important. To Ian's point about user adoption, that's a good way to think about, because architects, we're always communicating. We manage the relationships with stakeholders, and so the point about the user adoption is a good one, because that is a way that you can take a metric that's often associated with, let's say your metrics are typically around time or cost or something like that, and so it's not really ideal when you want to track a metric that is providing business value but may increase your cost. And so how do you position that? And so framing it around user adoption, or framing it in the context of a metric that is associated with the value you're driving and not the cost that you're incurring, is a good way to communicate that metric out as well. And I think to Inez's last point there too is you've identified the metrics and you're tracking them, but do you have an action plan for when the metric is off, or it's not, you know, within your acceptable range or whatever you're tracking? That's next, because a lot of times I've been at customers where, okay, we have the metric, we're tracking it. Okay, it's not we're not hitting the metric value that we're looking for. What do we do next? And we don't have that action plan. So when you're identifying the metrics, be sure that you can baseline them, be sure that you can communicate them the way you want to, and then make sure you have an action plan to do something when you're off track.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Spot on. Matthias, if you would like to share some of your experience around the key metrics and project governance.
Yep, thank you. So I think, first of all, it's already, to me, very interesting how we all look quite, how do you say, quite different to a very basic concept like governance. And I think the input I'll give is more from a project management perspective. But still, I think there's also a lot of touch points with what have been said earlier. But for me, what's very important in your governance, and it's really from the beginning of your project, is if there's enough strategic alignment, for instance, being in touch with the right people on the client side, and also the people who might decide on budgets, might decide on, let's say, the vision for the company and so on, is for me super important. And it's also something, at least I see as a KPI. Are there enough touch points? Are we still on track? Do we have the same vision? And it's also indeed then following up into the user adoption, as Ian touched upon. Same thing I also noted, delivering value, but I think Mark also touched that. And then there's certain things you need to manage, which for me is also part of the KPI. So managing your resources on the project, your timeline, are we still on track, and the performance of the team. And last but not least, also, of course, the risks. I think we've all faced a lot of difficult times on the project, timelines being at risk and so on. So all of these things for me is also part of KPIs, which, at least from my perspective, I try to track in whatever project we face.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then I think I'll change the mood a little bit. So I think, especially, when we talked about governance, we also talked about governance horror stories. So you can obviously abstract out the client details and the project details, but if you have any stories where I think governance really went wrong and some of the lessons you learned, and I'll actually open it up to whoever wants to go first. It does not mean that others do not have a governance horror story. I think all of us have been through that phase, but what were some of the challenges and what were some of the key lessons? I think that's what we would like to learn. And I'm sure Ian has fixed many orgs in terms of his role at Elements Cloud, and he has a few to share, but I'll open it up whoever wants to go first.
I'll kick us off. The number one pain point or horror story is always getting to a customer. They've been delivering, and I think Ian's going to be able to speak really keenly on this. Is they've been delivering stuff, right? And the teams have been working, but it's not at all aligned to the benefits that were identified when the Salesforce purchase was made initially. And so there's a lot of investment that's been, there's a lot of work that's been done. Teams have been staffed, things have been delivered, but it's not hitting the stakeholders are not seeing the value that they expected when they bought it. License maybe sitting on the shelf, that sort of thing. And so that conversation is always a difficult one, but should be an easy one. It's like you have the benefits typically realized at the beginning. You have the objectives that you want. You should be able to identify those and track them through on the user stories, even all the way through. So you know what you're delivering is what you identified at the beginning and aligns to the corporate objectives. That has happened several times. I would say that's maybe a typical horror story. And I was fortunate enough to be staffed on a lot of red accounts in my professional services days. So that's one that's really close to my heart, turning that sort of thing around.
Someone, a very, very big customer, they described it as having a confetti of solutions. Okay, every one of them was beautiful. You looked at them in isolation, it was amazing. But actually they weren't connected. They were all individual. And what they discovered over time was people go through and go, right, we need to clear up technical debt. Right, we'll delete that application because no one's using it. And then 3 months later, a requirement will come up for an identical application. So I think it starts, and I think one of your slides at the beginning talked about strategy, which is we need to think about this as a product with a roadmap, not a series of independent user stories that someone says, oh, can you build me that? Can you build me this? And I think if there are admins listening or architects, we need to think more like product managers. So Elements is a product. We have a product management team. We think about a roadmap. We think about phasing functionality. We think about when we're going to bring new functionality in. We think about prioritization of that functionality. I think we need to think about our Salesforce implementations and the connected systems with a roadmap. So then we can start to prioritize. And as Mark said, get the value. And maybe actually there's a high risk piece of work we need to do, but we'll push that back because we can get better value from an earlier piece of work with some important users. So I think that concept of a high level roadmap starts to anchor all the other things that we're doing. And it also makes it a lot easier to push back on requirements to go, that's great, but I'm going to put that in phase 3. Because we all know phase 3 never gets delivered. So if you want to push things back, you push it into phase 3. And therefore, we've got a roadmap that starts to set out, okay, this is how we're going to deliver. These are the benefits associated with it. These are the stakeholders I need to engage at certain points in time. And that suddenly life becomes easier and it makes it easier to scope work. So we're trying to avoid that idea of a confetti of solutions, rather than actually having an integrated solution we're building moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Valid points. Anyone else wants to share their personal experience of governance?
I will go next. So there are multiple horror stories, right? But one of the most common one that comes in my mind is when the task is given, let's say, again, I will go very kind of the micro level here. So when the user story is handed over to someone, right, the developer or someone, they assume that their job is done once the code is in code or configuration, whatever is in UAT, testing team give the blessing, right? And that's all. But that's not really the definition of done, right? So as a part of the definition of done, the team should really consider, hey, you implemented the capability, functionality. Do you have proper Apex test classes? Not the 75% test coverage, but really the functional coverage, right? Does it asserts everything that it's supposed to do, right? Does it has a test cases that can be used when it's time to go live? Because during that live, you need to have end-to-end testing. You need to have a system integration testing. I have seen QA team keep struggling towards end, and then there is a fight between the QA team and the dev team and all other team. Hey, we don't have all the test cases. No, you should have supposed to get the test cases when we developed it, right? So many back and forth, right? Just because nobody observed definition of done. No clear documentation, right? You created amazing functionality, maybe because of flow, maybe because of maybe using Apex classes, but where is the documentation and why was it done, right? Do you have a decisioning? Do you have the link? Okay, architectural review board was done, right? As a part of that review board, this was the decision made. Everything, either is it in meeting, it's scattered documentation here and there, and then people comes back and say, hey, we are doing an agile does not go with the documentation, right? Those kind of the terms. So there are so many horror stories, but I will say the most common that I always face is really the meaning of definition of done and how that correlates throughout the life cycle of the delivery, performance testing, go live. You are on the live window. 1 week back, there is no one central document saying clearly indicating what is the pre-deployment step, what is the manual step, what is the post-deployment step, what is the manual step. Everything is scattered, right? So I will say that is the most common thing that I have seen.
Just
yeah, absolutely.
Copado. Define everything in Copado. I mean, how hard can this be?
But
yeah,
that's such a good point. To piggyback on that, there's seemingly technical issues are usually governance issues in disguise, right? Like when the problem arises, so there's a technical solution for that. But if you start with making it a governance issue and starting with the process and making documentation discoverable and accessible by everybody that needs it, that's really common as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Jitendra made a great point that I think if it doesn't tie back into the requirement, like I was told very early in my career, if it doesn't tie back to the requirements, whatever you have built is not a feature, it is actually a bug. And I think that is the way we should look at it. There should be 100% traceability back to the requirement phase. Ines, Matthias, anything you want to share on this topic? Any personal experiences?
Sure. I mean, for me, one of the things, if you go even a bit further down the chain, what I tend to struggle the most is this cry from individuals to have a false sense of security, right? Being these rigid artificial controls, they just say to failure. So I just give you a story, try to change the names. So it's the story of a busy, bossy puppet, right? No time for being present, for decisions, for empathy, for care. Right? This bossy is do it now, do it this way, very command and control. Puppet is for them and they, excuses, unable, and I challenge unwilling to help to move forward. Think of a PO, program manager. The busy, bossy puppets would last minute not show up for planning and most often be unseen in retrospective, and any other sort of project touch point would come with demands without their listening ears, and it will infuse some ridiculous, really heavyweight bureaucracy, sort of weekly reports, meetings, which are manual and horrid slide decks reports, right? Extended UAT, all these go, no go meetings, portfolio presentations and approvals and release handovers. So heavier, right? Bureaucracy, I think it should be called bureaucracy. There is more to the story in this example. And we did some work at the PO and leadership level. So we could craft a common understanding of direction. like an evidence board where you have your purpose and you have different areas and personas, right? Think of OKRs. And that thing, it becomes an artifact, tangible, that anybody, like Mark was saying, anybody can refer back. It's like an information radiator. It was really difficult. It really slowed us down. As too many lines of communications, too many pauses, too much time and effort invested into status now rather than progress. And that kind of links for me the major, biggest problems that we have in organizations. That is, how can we move from this obsession of the right now to infuse and reduce feedback loops, right? So we have three sort of things at organization level that we focus. One is about strategy. One is about the current, the right now. And one should be, which is not often there, is about validation. Most of the time, we invest a lot of time of a strategy. Let's try to foresee the world 18 months time. We know that doesn't play well.
Yep.
The second one is about the right now. How many pauses, how many distractions, how many overheads we infuse with our obsession of the right now? And where is the validation? Are those things that we putting out there actually being used, like Jan was mentioning? Are they giving us the results that we wanted, right? So yeah, there you go. Those are my thoughts and a little story.
I think the current state to future state, it can be a happy path or it can be a horror story, and I think we have all experienced both directions. Matthias, anything you want to share from your experience? And mind you, like whatever people are sharing, these are not representative of their employers. We don't want to get anybody fired from their jobs. These are just our personal experiences. Yeah, Matthias, go for it.
Thanks. So I'll try to give us as few details as possible. But if you ask me for one of my, let's say, horror stories, the first thing that come to mind is I was on a project for some time, which actually started with, I think, 5-6 consultants and grew into a very large deployment model with over 35 consultants. And what I really saw, and for me, it really shows the value of a rigid governance structure is over time, we were just adding resources without keeping in mind that governance changed. And sometimes it's very small things, right? So an example which I sometimes give to other people is, let's say you have 5 developers or whatever, doesn't matter which role. You just add 2 or 3 more, and you normally have a daily stand-up of 15 minutes. What are you doing then? Are you extending the timeline of your meeting? Are you giving everybody less time? Same, for instance, you have a certain amount of business analysts. Okay, your client knows exactly to who they need to go to. Okay, you're just adding business analysts. Do the client still know who they're going to, or are we splitting up responsibilities and so on? So by adding resources, it's not just always +1 headcount, but you really need to revise at certain points your governance if it's still clear, if the communication lines are still valid, and it's really like sums up all these small different changes, make your project or your team X amount of times more complex, and that's for me really where a solid governance comes into place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, this could go on and for a few hours. I think all of us have experienced different variations of this. We actually have Sweth who wants to share his story as well. So Sweth, unmute yourself and go for it.
Thank you. So for me, this will speak to all of us who are either CTAs or on the path to becoming CTA. So we all know that access and licenses are like one of the first slides, right? If you get the licenses wrong, the whole thing will crumble. So I got into a project which already had an org. And basically, for some reason, the client was sold a bunch of platform licenses. And yet this was a clear case for a partner community because their partners were actually doing all the selling. And the company itself needed to be able to view the deals, opportunities, and then collaborate in those opportunities and do the actual fulfillment and installation. I kid you not, solar panels, right? You see that in a lot of scenarios. This is actually a solar panel installation company. And so because there was sold platform licenses and no partner community was anywhere to be found. The original vendor decided to re-engineer the entire sales process because obviously you don't have access to opportunities with the platform. Opportunities were not used, everything is custom. I come in and they said, you know what? We have a new account executive at Salesforce, and we were advised that we should go with a different makeup. So we bought a bunch of partner licenses, and I say, great. So what do? You have to set up the community, bare bones, just give them access to those same objects, records, but what do you have to do now? And it's not gonna be a long story, I promise. You have to mass transfer records, right? Because partner community people are different than internal community people. Same people, right? You just transfer the license, then you have to transfer records so they can still continue working with those same records. And I said, so in terms of governance, what do you do? What are the dependencies? What is the sequence of events, right? So you build out the bare bones community, you then basically expose those objects, then you transfer records, and then, and only then, can you give up those licenses back to Salesforce and say thank you. What instead happened is the Salesforce AE turns off all of the platform licenses. Obviously, they have the partner licenses, but nobody's using them. So the entire team of 30 to 40 people cannot sell any longer because they don't see anything like that. The deal is done. And I said, okay, go back to the AE, please, very quickly ask for courtesy licenses. And say up to 1 month. We should be able to do this within 1 month conservatively, right? Somebody's going to sit there all weekend long and mass transfer records. That if that's what needs to happen, that's what will happen. And so I wrote up the whole plan, and then I left that company, right? So I left the company. I check in a year later. And said, yep, we're still on those courtesy licenses. How's that possible? You've been doing this for a year, right? This should have been done. Well, we're ready to leave this implementation partner because the PM says yes to everything. And in the end, nothing gets done. So we talk about governance, that's on an enterprise level. On a smaller level, right? On a very micro level, I think it really, lion's share falls on the PM and the SA, right? So that's where the governance needs to happen. The PM doesn't always know, right? What is technically feasible, the limitations, et cetera. So SA should know. SA and PM, they need to work, lockstep and advise the stakeholders. In the end, there was also a failure on the stakeholder level because they didn't think to check on these things. They just took the advice from the AE, now Salesforce, who's also probably not that technical, face value. Oh, okay, so we need this, so that's what we're going to do. So further on, the stakeholders got tired of this problem, just said, okay, whatever, we'll keep paying Salesforce. Hopefully this will go away. It's kind of like not taking care of your teeth and hopefully it will go away. No. And the stakeholders changed over. So we got now new people with new priorities. At the end of the day, the sales process is not yet defined. The service process is still tightly coupled to the sales process. There's no partner community. They have licenses they're not using, and they have courtesy licenses. And now Salesforce is contacting them every month saying, hey, you either give us back the licenses or you start paying for CRM as well as partner communities, so that they're overpaying now. So that ball of wax has still not been unraveled. And I came in, I did an assessment of this, basically a very fixed fee, kind of 10 hours. And I said, some of these same recommendations persist. This is the plan. I say, hire this company, and they are now with another implementation partner, number 3 now, trying to do this. Obviously, I work for someone else. I'm not working with them. But that's my horror story for you. It starts with the licenses, moves on to the PM and the SA to control this whole thing. So very much a real thing. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Actually, a very interesting question came in. It's on a direct chat. So the question is for the 2 CTAs in the panel, Jitendra and Mark. How important is governance from a review board perspective, and how do you best prepare for it? Jitendra, since you are a little bit more fresh on the review board, maybe you want to go first, and then we'll come to Mark.
Well, I will go, but yeah, Mark is judge. I'm pretty sure Mark will have a better answer. So yes, I will say governance is very, very important from the CTA point of view. And I will say that is a one topic that you cannot fake, okay? Because that section, I will say, is very subjective, and you would be able to answer the questions from the judges only if you have faced those things. So for an example, scenario says you have to go live in 4 months or 6 months, right? You simply saying, hey, this is going to be the solution would not work, right? You need to have whole strategy in place, right? Whole testing methodology there, how you're going to build the test data, how you're going to set up a environment, right? And also, just I'm throwing an example, right? Why the governance is very example. Let's say you have to go live in 6 months, and one of your solution architect decisions saying that, hey, I'm going to introduce MDM solution as a part of the implementation itself, right? In my opinion, if you have ever worked, right, it is not very mature to say that, hey, you are replacing few system, you're going live with the Salesforce, and at the same time, you're also introducing too much change, and you're also introducing MDM in the mix. So just to give you an example that how your solution and your experience would tie back with the governance itself. Another example is you are suggesting that, okay, I'm going to go with the mobile strategy, right? Native mobile application or custom mobile application. Then have you thought about their timeline, right? Do you know what exactly do you need to build for the mobile? Do you have a skill set, right? Because CTA definitely is a hypothetical scenario, but in CTA, what it really does is it brings your actual experience, right, to that forum. And simply saying that, hey, I am going to build a native mobile application is not going to work, right? You have to have the whole process and the timeline saying that, hey, why you think that is a good idea? Do you think really you can go live in a 6 month, right? Same goes for the multi-org, right? You say, okay, I'm going to go with a multi-org in 6 months, think, right? 2-3 months would only get you where like all the requirements, all the compliance, security, everything is there. So I think, yes, governance is really a one section, I will say, that you might not able to fake it, right? And you really need to make sure you know your stuff. You know Agile, you know how the waterfall works, right? You know how the solution, timeline, estimation, everything would work together.
Yeah, absolutely. And since Mark is a judge, so I'll actually rephrase the question. So Mark, as a judge, when you are specifically judging governance, and again, feel free to abstract out any details, what is it that you typically look for in a CTA candidate?
Yeah, this is a good one because a lot of the times the candidates will come out with just pretty much a boilerplate governance solution. I'm going to do Agile, set up a COE, and that doesn't really fly. And it's unfortunate if you do have to do a governance retake, because like this is really actually governance is your chance to shine in that section, because like Jitendra's saying, it's very subjective, and it's the place where you can take the characteristics that just differentiate CTAs from other architects is that, you know, you have that executive presence and that leadership ability on the project. So that experience that you have there really comes out in the governance section, rather than like these technical implementation requirements in the other parts. And so the boilerplate solutions, you know, need to be expanded. You have to, just as much as the solution, the correct solution is important, the justification is also very important, if not more, in the eyes of the judge. And then tying it back to the scenario. So like very well could be that, you know, COE is the solution, or Agile or Scale Agile, depending on what else is going on in the scenario. But just like every other requirement in the board, tie it back to the scenario and the requirement, justify your decision there, and don't just go with a boilerplate governance solution. That's probably my number one piece of feedback for that section.
Yep, very valid point. I think I think like it's often perceived as one of the easier areas in the review board, but like from whatever I've heard from people, like it is not, and it is often also an area where people fail. So okay, as much as I would love to go on and ask questions on my behalf, I think we had 100 people on the call. Now it's down to around 85 or so. And there are a lot of questions, and there is a gold mine of a discussion happening in the chat as well. So like I would encourage everyone to follow those comments. What I would also encourage is, if you have a question and if you want me to ask it on your behalf, please put it in the chat. Otherwise, I'll just start reading out the questions that we had in the chat, because we have about 30 minutes left. And then, yeah, if you want to ask yourself, please raise your hand and I'll come to you in a little bit. So the first question was from Sombir. He asked, what governance points should be taken care of while implementing Salesforce to Slack integration, particularly when it involves external accounts for Slack communication channels for data file sharing, especially if it includes federal as well. And I think this is coming. I know Sombir, I think he wrote a blog recently about Salesforce Slack integration. We have a very knowledgeable audience. And Sombir, I would actually like if you share your blog post in the chat as well. But anyone wants to take that question, I'll just post it in the chat again. It's a long question, so it may not be easy to kind of go for it. Mark, is Slack something that you're very familiar with, Slack to Salesforce and the federal space?
I would say no. Personally, that's a very targeted use case. I do not have that particular experience. But when it comes to Slack integrations, I would say like a lot of the general, especially the DevOps governance metrics we're talking about here, apply part of it's internally, for instance, if I wanted to deploy an app, even if it was just posting messages into a channel internally, the governance process to get an app approved into our workspace, our internal workspace, is very, it's a very rigorous process to go through security approval and get the app and look at all the endpoints and get them approved. And has it been tested in your development workspace before you're asking for it to be approved into the production workspace? That's there. And then my number one, from a government perspective, and getting back to the metrics and how you communicate that when we're talking about Slack, is what's the productivity gains? What's the value that you're driving through this integration by now surfacing this piece of functionality within Slack and not, requiring somebody to go back into Salesforce or whatever it might be. So I'd be looking at those metrics and how you can communicate the value there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Can I pick a point up here? I mean, someone in the channel slightly earlier talked about documentation, and documentation feels like a dirty word in the whole world of Agile, which is everything gets done instantly, and that clearly isn't true. We're now, Salesforce is not an island. When I started 20 years ago, there were 5 objects. It was pretty straightforward. We're talking about, the question that's just come up is Slack. Slack is a separate system. It has its own security model. It has its own way of working. We're now connecting Salesforce to multiple systems, and we need to make sure we have decent documentation in place. And that means documentation at level of enterprise architecture, documentation in terms of why. Someone said, why do we build things? I think Jitendra said, it's not just what you built, but why did you build it? It's the process documentation to understand how this all hangs together. And I think it's very easy to throw that all out and go, we're doing Agile, we don't need to do documentation. Agile doesn't mean taking shortcuts. It means chunking things into smaller pieces of work so we can be more responsive. You still have to have that metadata dictionary with documentation. You still need to have processes documented. You still need to have enterprise architecture documented. If you don't do that, it will come back and bite you later. And it's the core of governance. We talked about user stories. That's an important part of documentation. But I think what we're seeing now is that it's actually the connecting points between all that documentation is where the power is. Knowing that metadata is touched by that user story to support that process as part of that enterprise architecture, that's where the power is. When we have lots of disparate documentation, then suddenly it becomes very difficult to understand the implications of making changes, and that kills agility. So we need to think about running Salesforce and the connected systems as we would do with any other big enterprise application. It's no longer an island. We have to make sure we are applying the disciplines that we had 20 years ago when we were building big SAP systems, but then apply it to this new, more rapid development approach, but not throw away some of the good practices we had when we were building those systems in terms of making sure that we do put that connected documentation in place. And that's true whether it's Slack or other systems. And the more connected systems we have, the more risk we put into it. But we can mitigate that risk with decent documentation.
Yeah, spot on. Jitendra, you wanted to add something?
I am actually chatting. I will post a chat, Gaurav, so we can use that time for some other question.
Sure, yeah, and just a couple of points from my end. I think based on my experience, because I've worked in the state, local, and federal state. So anytime you talk about federal, I think compliance also becomes a key aspect of your overall project governance. Because without those compliances, you really cannot proceed. I think one of the, I would say, pitfalls or one of the advantages of working in these sectors is that it is very, very regulated. So even if you don't want it, I think those compliances are something that you have to absolutely abide by. Next question was from Prabhat. So since we're talking about the key pillars of good governance, I would like to ask, what are some of those alarms that we should be aware that indicate that it's not a good governance? And I'll actually flip the order. So Matthias, if you want to take that one, like what are some of the red flags in a project that the governance is not really up to the mark?
For me, it starts maybe a little bit earlier, and in the beginning of the project, there's some questions that needs to be answered, and those will help you define if your governance is rigid enough for the actual project. And one of these is, what is actually our responsibility? And it comes to what you just said as well, in terms of legislation and so on. Are all these things part of your responsibility as an implementer or as a consultant or not? And there's so many different questions you need to ask in the beginning of the project, also considering timelines and so on which you can then build your governance structure, and which will then, in my opinion, make sure that you'll be able to deliver and not have all of these red flags, right? And can you maybe, just because the last part was very specifically a question, can you just repeat it once more? Because I just
absolutely. I'll put it in the chat. So it's the last question in the chat. So what are some of those alarms that we should be aware that it is not good governance? So
yeah. So I think one of the first things you'll see when your governance is not set up correctly is the communication, right? If it's not clear, both from an integrator perspective as from your client's perspective, if people are not sure who to contact for what, if people are taking certain responsibilities and giving certain updates, for instance, for topics which they're not necessarily responsible for, those for me are the first red flags to see, okay, you need to revise your governance structure, you need to see where the communication flow should go through. Also, one of the things I often saw as well is if you really have very large bottlenecks. So a lot of times in the project, and I think most of us faced it, is if a lot of questions pass through one specific person, which makes all of us waiting for an answer, timeline shifting and so on. This often also implies that or you don't have enough resources in your governance, or people are not asking the correct questions to the right people. I think for me that these are the first two that come to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sweth actually posted a really good point. And everything is the highest priority, and the client needs everything yesterday, today, or tomorrow. I think that's another red flag. Ian, what are some of the red flags that you look at from a governance perspective when you take on a new project or a new client?
Yeah, my days at Accenture before Elements, I was responsible for big programs, and it was normally big turnarounds. I think biggest project team I had was 500 people on the team. And when I inherited all of those, the first question is, show me the signed off scope statement. Show me, there are normally 100 things going wrong, but there are 3 big things you need to fix, and you find those 3 things and the other 97 get worse. But that's okay because you're trying to fix it. And the 3 things are normally scope, resourcing, and timeline. And again, the first red flag is, have we got a clear view about what the scope is? Have we got a clear, signed off by the project sponsors who are still there? So I think a story earlier was that the sponsor had left and we've got new sponsors. Have we got a scope statement signed off by the sponsor with a business case? So we've actually got that level of support. And then have we now got then the next thing is, have we got a governance cycle in place for making changes to that? So unless we've got that set, then we're building on sand. We're not building on any foundations. So the first thing I always go and look at is, like, who signed off the scope statement? Are they still around? Do we still have project sponsorship? Do we still know we're going in the right direction?
Yep. Ines, any insights from you? Governance, like alarms or red flags, are closely related to, I think, risk management as well. And I think that's an area where you are really strong. So would love to hear your feedback as well.
Well, I like to give a bit of a different perspective to this. So one thing that is important to look at in the terms of how we evolve and grow and develop over time is the ability for us to be locally attuned and responsive. And the governance and the things that you put in place have to enable this to happen. Right? Otherwise, you're going to put yourself in a bottleneck. So are we able to adapt and respond? Meaning the only constant is change, right? And changes comes with risk, and we humans, we can foresee and not very good at thinking in systems, including, how we influence the systems and how we're going to respond beyond of the visible. So knowing that we should expect the unexpected is how you enable that machine, right? That human alive system to operate. Another one for me is about how can we incorporate diversity in our governance, right? As the elements change, so will the bonds and the connections in between. It's basically meta a little bit the architecture into the human system that you have. Right? Another one is about how can we maintain integrity through self-renewal. So quick wins, not so sure about that, but fresh starts in the way that you're looking at things. You're going to have shocks into the system. And that if we look at nature, when you have a shock into the system, it rapidly descales and simplifies. And you can see this often with new technology coming through or with product team changing and things like that. And one very important is about how can you embed resilience. And you normally do this through variations, through redundancy and decentralization. And redundancy is something we don't have enough in teams, in knowledge, in access to information in teams. So how can you have those vertex or those multiple different beyond one point of failure? So few things that I think is worth to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of good inputs coming in the chat. And in fact, it doesn't really feel like an architect meetup. It feels like a project team bashing the client. But yeah, keep going. And since Ines, you mentioned like change is typically very, very difficult to manage with governance. So there is a very interesting question from Vikram, and then again, I'll post it in the chat so like you have it towards the end. But he asks like governance in relation to change always adds friction. What are different techniques, tools has this forum used on their projects to optimize? And I think it's a classical example of like project scope and change orders. And again, I think it's a problem which I think all of us have faced. So Mark, I'll probably lean on you. How do you deal with change management as a potential threat to good governance?
So as you can probably tell, a big part of my focus when it comes to governance is the stakeholder management side. So it's the communication side of the governance responsibilities. So red flags are often for me like when you come in and a metric that isn't often captured is percentage of stakeholders that are satisfied with what's happening, done through surveys. And the only way that you can do that is through dashboards or regular stakeholder sessions that are aligning to a 30, 60, 90 day, and you're referring to dashboards. And that communication plan is how you manage that change strategy. Also, someone earlier brought up the fact that you have architectural review boards in place. And so as changes come up, you can take them to different areas of the business to see how it might impact across. Because another red flag is a lot of times you come into an implementation and there is redundant architecture across the implementation. So you have, order architecture here, project architecture there, and then another business unit has a redundant architecture in the same org. Another business unit may have purchased Salesforce Industries that layers another on top. And so being able to have the architecture review board and identify that, have stakeholders aligned on what's being intake and prioritization helps to manage that. And the way that I've done that is creating, the right dashboards to communicate this change, stakeholder sessions on a regular basis, 30, 60, 90 plans that are updated for them to see that, and then maintaining that satisfaction measure with the stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll move a little bit faster because the questions are piling up and I think we have close to 20 minutes. So there's a very interesting question from Christ, and I think it's more of a challenge. Like, would you even start a project without a well-established governance model in place? I think it's a little bit of a reality versus a project situation. So I don't know who wants to take it, but like given a choice, I think nobody would start a project without a well-established governance model in place. I think in a lot of cases, it's common to borrow the governance model from a similar project. But if anyone wants to add some inputs in terms of what they think, Ian, you want to say something on this?
Good governance. I want to pick up the previous point as well. Good governance doesn't add friction. Bad governance adds friction. Okay. Good governance means that you're building the right stuff, which saves you a ton of rework downstream. So it's about putting the right level of governance in place. So again, if you're a multi-org, 10,000 users, there's a level of governance you require there. If you're starting a project, there's some minimum governance, which must be stakeholders, sponsorship, scope agreed, some simple way of actually managing change. Maybe you don't need a ton of other governance associated with that you would expect for a major organization, but then you need to grow into that as the project grows. So I think it's about picking the right level of governance. But would you start without having those in place? You can start, but you're actually going to have to go back and do it later, and it'll cost you way more. And I mean, one little story I can remember back from my Accenture days, I couldn't get the project sponsors to all agree a scope. And I said, well, that's fine. I'll stop the project then, because I'm not moving forward, because I know that it's not going to deliver well if you can't agree the correct scope and you can't turn up to a project steering committee. Let's all go home. And they went, oh, okay, we didn't think it was that serious. Yes, it is that serious. If you as the project steering committee can't turn up to meetings to agree what the scope is, let's not get started. And I think we need to have that level of confidence rather than going, oh, well, we bought the licenses, let's just see what we can do with them. That's fine if we're playing with 5 licenses in a corner somewhere, but that's not the conversation we're having anymore. The conversation we're having is about enterprise systems delivering serious amounts of value, and therefore we need to put the right level of governance in place. And I wrote a long blog about sort of the 13 pillars of the Centre of Excellence, but part of that is saying about how you phase that. Which things do you have to have in place day one? Which things can you leave till later? I'll post a link to it. But it's trying to put the right level of governance in at the time of the project, rather than, because it's way more expensive to try and put it in after the fact, and you lose so much value, you lose the trust of the business users because you're not delivering. So the simple answer is, don't start a project unless you've got the right level of governance in place.
Yeah. The next question is from Barbara, and I think she managed, like, again, it's very similar to what Ian, you already mentioned. And I think the crux of it is like, not everybody's on the same page, and stakeholder management is obviously a challenge. So any advice on how to best communicate the importance of enterprise governance? So Jitendra, you want to share in terms of how you do this? Is it done through steering committees, or is there another means to achieve this?
Yeah, so what I have seen, right, mostly the two type of the customers, right? Either they say that, hey, we have a governance, that governance may not be the right governance, right? But they do say, yes, we have a Center of Excellence, governance, change control board. Another scenario just like what Ian said, right? There's no governance at all, right? So if there are no governance at all, right, what we normally do is you don't have to set up a governance first upfront itself, right? You can go crawl, walk, run. It takes, I will say, a week at least minimum. That will play what are the bodies, what are the groups you need. You set up that high level body, right? And again, governance is not something that you cannot come back and you cannot change it, right? But having a one side that, okay, you're trying to understand what the governance needs to like, but at the same time, I would not start implementation itself. I will start with the blueprint phase. Now, the blueprint phase is normally where the second question came, right? How to show the value, right? So showing the value is really, I think Mark also said that just doing the work, delivering the story is not going to work. You have to tie it back to the value orchestration. When you are going to deliver something, what value you are going to bring, right? And so driving your whole solution, whole conversation from the value itself, I will say is the right thing to do. Having some KPI, maybe the Gartner quadrant, right? Because Gartner, those kind of the magazine, they already have done all the heavy lifting, all the researches and everything. So if you want to sell something, if you want to convince your stakeholder on something, right, just simply saying that, hey, this is the best practice or we should do, they will not agree. You have to have backed it up by the data, right? You really have to paint the future, or paint the picture, basically saying that, hey, if you go with this, right, this is all the problem or this is the situations you're going to face. But let's say if you go with this, maybe this is upfront cost in terms of resources, in terms of maybe the complexity, or maybe you have to buy something, but in the long term, this is all the advantages that you're going to get. It's same thing, right? Like someone say, hey, why do I need an Einstein prediction license, right? Or why do I need Einstein, right? I already have reports on the dashboard. But then you have to maybe pilot them and say, hey, these are the group of the 5 users, right, who have Einstein prediction builder enabled, see their performance compared to the others, right? So really everything has to be backed by the KPIs, by the data. Then, and that makes the conversation with the stakeholders pretty easy to convince them, right, that, okay, this is what the value they are going to get.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's a very interesting question from Nitin, and I'll actually post it in the chat. So Mark, I'll actually pose this one to you. So he says that governance in a steady state is a different challenge from governance in a specific project. So when we typically talk about like governance in projects versus governance in large transformational programs, which may involve multiple projects, what kind of recommendations, principles that might differentiate it from specific project governance? So how would you do governance differently for a large program, say to say, which involves multiple projects versus doing it for a specific project? Because again, there's a one size fits all kind of a theory, which may not actually work in all the cases.
It's a good question. I think it's probably you take the best practices that you do at a project level and you raise that up to a program level, right? And so that's similarly you're still going about the stuff that Jitendra was just going over with, identifying the benefits that you're tracking across these different projects. The stakeholder management side, you're just doing it at a program level. I'm interested to hear what other people say, because I'm kind of going blank on there. But I would say, at the best practices you have, the stakeholder management strategies that you have, the tracking of the KPIs, because you're not at the program level, not as focused on the technical pillars of governance. That's happening at the project level. So the DevOps strategies, there's a reuse element there though. So you want to be able to reuse those same destinations that you have for surfacing documentation. If you have test automation in place, you want to be able to reuse the elements that you have at the project level. But from a governance perspective, you're really more focused on, I'd say, that stakeholder management than you would be across the programs, across the different projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think mostly the chat questions are done. So as I just posted in the chat, I think we have a very knowledgeable audience. So down to the last 10 minutes. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, again, related to CTA journey and how it relates to governance, related to your specific projects, please raise your hand and then we can unmute you and then you can ask your question. As I said, this is a very elite panel and we're very fortunate to have all of them together. So it's a good opportunity to ask some questions.
Just to chip in a bit in terms of the overall program portfolio, whole organization sort of vision, one of the things as a tool, as a frame, is the OKR, so the objective key results, right? So as organization, what are we after? Are we, let's say, I'm biased obviously in the subject, but we're going to reduce our footprint by 50% next year. What does that look like? You may have multiple different sort of teams or programs looking at the same thing. What is the key result that you are after? how you're going to break it down, what are the different actions are, and what are the connections in between them, right? So what are the modular nested components that you're going to be looking at reusing and taking the most out of it? Where is your redundancy to make sure that that objective key result is actually out the door?
Yep.
That point is like the number one governance point that I try to drive home every time I have a conversation with a customer, that those metrics that you're tracking from the top all the way down to the work being delivered, whether it's in a project or across the program, is so important, often missed, or done at the beginning and not well maintained, and then just kind of, lost its way.
Yep. Christian, you had a question. I see you unmuted.
Yeah, so it was actually just a comment to how I think a program versus a project governance differs. So at the program level, it's often more at a business level, you could say, with the planning of the project portfolio, seeing the dependencies and knowing what's coming down the line, whether it's in M&A insights that some people might have, so they know where some things might need to be placed at a later time. And then I think also you could say program enablers that aren't specific business-driven projects, so to say, even though we say everything should tie back, nobody from the business is saying we want DevOps or we want whatever enabler, but we know it will accelerate value delivery. So I think those types of things are at the program level, but not often at the project level as such. Just a comment.
Yeah. And then Sweth had a question from a review board perspective. Any opinion on suggesting to use one major tool for orchestration, like Copado can orchestrate pipelines, quality gates, automated testing, back promotions, and ALM? Mark, Jitendra, either of you have an opinion on this?
I will say again, it depends on situation, right? So if the situation says that in-house they don't have an expertise, right? Definitely, like Mark said previously, right? It's all boils down to the justification, right? Your justification could be your in-house does not have expertise and you have to set up quickly, right? Board review, I don't think is pinned down to any particular tool like Copado or any other tool, right? You just have to justify, right, that why Copado, like the resource skill set, right? How it would help. Is there any requirement? Not the boilerplate, like Mark said, right? You cannot say in the future, you paint the picture very beautiful that you can do this, that. Those are not the requirement. What is the requirement or what exactly that would fit into? So I don't see any issue, even suggesting Copado if you can just handle the justification and question.
Yeah,
totally
Mark, anything
agree.
you want to add?
Yeah, totally agree. There's not, it all comes down back to the scenario and related to let's say there's a use case for Salesforce Industries, and if you have velocity experience, that Copado does it really well, treating the configuration that's stored in records as metadata when you're doing those deployments. So as long as you tie that justification back to the scenario, then that's the most important thing rather than the tool of choice. And that goes for every layer too. So even if you're talking about the integration layer and selecting an ESB or an ETL tool, you want to consider, is there already something in place at the customer, and you're looking to solve in the customer's best interest, not just to always place Salesforce products in the center. So from an enterprise architecture perspective, it's more about having that understanding and that expertise than it is about always placing a Salesforce product. It's the customer scenario that's important.
100%. And I think Ines put in an excellent quote, like context is everything. Ines, you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so we tend to think that there is a magic there is the concept of God complex where individual will think that knows it all. Now, I think we often suffer from external God complex where we think a magic someone or something, mostly thought of technology, is going to come and save us, right? And when we should be looking at what do we have right now, constraints are a great creativity and power. So if we look at the tools, the individuals, what is our context right now, you can make amazing things. This external God complex can come and bite you back badly.
And I think we'll take one last question that is from Jake, and then I'll wrap it up. We have a couple of slides that we usually use to wrap up our session. So Jake asks, if you went into an org that had no governance setup at all, what is the thing that you would enforce to help? And I think this is exactly in the sweet spot for Ian. Ian, would you want to talk about what you would do in this situation?
Yeah, I think I posted a link in the chat to sort of the 13 pillars of the Center of Excellence or governance. And of those 13 pillars, there are several which I think need to be in place first. So leadership is one of the key ones. Architecture is another key one. Some position about metadata management. Those are the key ones that you have to have in place first, which is going into the org. The first one is org discovery. It's like, what actually has been built? Number one. Number two, do you have the leadership in place to care about what you're going to build going forward? Because after that, and then do you have an architecture about what you've built and how that all comes together? Once you've got those in place, then you can start working on, okay, what's the roadmap going to look like? What are we actually meant to be building? What do we have DevOps? All those things will flow from that. But I think the first thing walking into an org is just setting the baseline. Who cares about this? Leadership. What have we built to date as in org discovery? And then what's the architecture in terms of how it's connected to other systems? Without that, again, you're not building on solid foundations. You need to get that in place first. Then you can start thinking about scope, thinking about roadmap, and all the things that follow on from that.
Yep, absolutely.
I'll post the link in the chat again to that document.
Yep, great insights. And I think we're just about on time. So I'll just quickly present our final slide. Hopefully you can see the slide. Yeah, so the links and the recording will be shared on the SAIMA YouTube channel, and we'll also post it an email via link via the meetup page, and then we'll keep you posted on the topics and date. We have a fairly healthy pipeline for a lot of very interesting topics that SAIMA is coming up. And as always, this is a very democratic group. If you want to become a presenter, a host, or you want to be associated with SAIMA in any capacity, then please do reach out, and we would love to have you. With that, I'll just stop sharing my screen. So thank you to all our panelists, and thank you, I think, to the audience. I think this is one of the most mature meetups I've ever been a part of. Like, I see several CTA candidates, I see book authors who are in the audience as well. So thank you once again for this wonderful discussion, and we hope to have you again at future SAIMA meetup. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.